It's just the background now makes it look really dark.
Cards Against Humanity. Welcome to the Cards Against Humanity Theater here in Chicago. For those of you who may not have played, Cards Against Humanity is we call it a comedy, we call it a party game for horrible people, but it's like an improvisational comedy board game that I made with my friends in 2009, 2010, so we are turning 10 years old this year. Cards Against Humanity is an independent game. Meaning we don't have a publisher, we don't have a distributor, we just started it in our parents' house and until they evicted us because we had like too many boxes. And it just, we put it online for free and people thought it was funny, and then from there we made a Kickstarter, and that paid for first printing, and then we did a second printing and a third printing, and now we have one of those offices where people sit on bouncy balls. So, so that's and one of our dreams for starting an office was to have a really cool theater and a public venue just like this, which is why we made this. And this is really the dream. You know, we do lots of comedy shows and organizer trainings and all kinds of cool community events here. But this is really the dream event is to have really cool and interesting guests and interesting conversations and open that up to the community. So, one cool thing I'll tell you about this theater before we get started. So, if you guys can see these lights, which are up here and here, these are the old CBS studio Klieg lights. So these were salvaged from the CBS studios when they got torn down by Kitty and Kevin from Curve Lampy, who also organized this event. And they generously donated them to us when we opened this theater. And these, my favorite thing about these lights is these are the lights that lit the Nixon-Kennedy debate. So we like to say these are, we like to say these are the lights that make Republicans sweat. Okay, so I think with that, I will bring up my friend and Chicago's #1 radio host who makes Republicans sweat, Mr. Ben Joravsky.
Make a dream come true. Just take two.
Sing some songs here. I'd like to bring on my good friend and colleague, Marianne Dukmasova. I always butcher her name.
One of these years, you'll get it right.
Maya is my colleague, my friend, and at the Chicago Reader. I've been working at the Reader for about 400 years. Maya is much younger than I am, as you can see, and hasn't been working there as long. We're about to, in addition to that, I host a podcast that's sponsored by the Reader and the Chicago Sun-Times called The Ben Joravsky Show. And as I start speaking now, I just want to say this. We are, this is part of our podcast. We're probably going to put this up on the internet on Saturday or Sunday. So people listening in this room, hello. People listening on the podcast, hello to you as well. And also, one last little announcement I'm very happy to say. Maya and I will be co-hosting a show at the Hideout, the bar over 1354 West Wabansie, which is not far from here. It's called First Tuesdays. That's the show. I did it for years and years with another dear friend of mine named Mick Dumke, and he just said, that's it, I've had enough. I want to spend more time with my family. He actually didn't say that, but that's just generally what people say at times like that. So thank you. And a little levity there. So at first call I made was to Maya, and I said, Maya, would you like to be my partner in crime at the Hideout? And Maya,
I don't have a family, so it's perfect.
Yeah, she has no excuse. So anyway, so that our first Tuesday show is coming up. It'll be November, and it'll probably be related.
November 5th.
November 5th, yes, indeed. It'll probably be related to the school situation, the school strike. There's no definite school strike yet in the city of Chicago, but I have a feeling that it'll probably be one by the time we do that Hideout show. So I'm hoping that we'll be discussing the successful completion of negotiations between Lori Lightfoot and the Chicago Teachers Union and how the city of Chicago made a great commitment to financing public education. I hope that's what we'll be talking about at the November 5th show. I sure hope we're not talking about a strike that would be entering its second week. So anyway, that's who we are. And I think you're the one who's going to do the introductions.
Well, let's, without further ado, bring up the person you're all here to see, Marianne Williamson. Marianne, come join us on stage. So, as you all know, Marianne is running for president. She's still in the race. She's a best-selling author and a spiritual and philosophical advisor to countless celebrities and ordinary people. She's a star in the $10 billion self-help industry and has sold over 3 million books. So my first question is, you know, you're rich and famous and very important in the world, in the corner of the world you come from. Why bother with politics? Are you bored? What made you decide to hop on this, you know, train of insanity of running for president?
I'm still stuck on the rich word, but I'm not sure.
Wait,
You're richer than me and Ben.
Wait, which
that's for
word were
sure.
you stuck on? I just didn't hear the which word.
Rich.
Oh, rich. Okay.
Donald Trump was elected president. And I think that changed. Forgive me, I have a cough drop in my mouth. I want to try to get rid of it.
Oh, well, that give me more time to talk about our show. You have some water right there.
I think the election of Donald Trump changed everything for everybody. It's almost like it should have changed things for everybody. And I think that I'm one of those people who think nothing is quite the same since the election of the president, in the sense that there are different questions about what we're doing with our lives, how we might help. I think to the conscious person, this was a very serious moment in American history. So I think a lot of us have thought, how can I help? And I've been a political activist for many years. My first book about politics came out in 1997, Healing the Soul of America. A lot of the things that you might think societally are like stage 4 cancers now were stage 1 cancers then. When I wrote that book in 1997, I was talking about mass incarceration, wealth inequality, the corporatocracy. These things were already there. I remember in the 90s people were saying, everything's so good. And I was saying even then, doesn't that depend on what neighborhood you're living in? Doesn't that depend on what part of the world you're living in? If you go to a doctor and you have stage 1 cancer, the doctor doesn't say it's stage 1, don't worry about it. Well, you know, you take care of these things at the time of beginnings. So to someone like myself, who is trained, now that's what my training is, look a little deeper. Look into cause and not just symptom. Look into cause and not just effect. And if you understand how the world works on some deeper level, you know that if there's cause, there will be an effect. It will make itself up to the to the surface of things. So I don't see Donald Trump as having created all of our problems. I see all of these problems as having created Donald Trump. And I see a political establishment that was in some ways unconsciously and in some ways willfully blind to these accumulating tensions, accumulating stress points. The political establishment knew how many people were suffering. This is not news. When you have 93 million people living in near poverty, this didn't just happen in the last 2 years. This massive transfer of wealth into the hands of 1% of Americans, this has been going on for 40 years. So when you have a political establishment that has not addressed the deeper causal issues, and even now, for the most part, is just addressing the externalities and the symptoms, I think it's time for those of us, many of whom have been standing on the periphery, we've been standing on the sidelines, but I think it's time for people who know that there are deeper psychological and emotional and moral and spiritual dynamics underneath the surface of things. We need the visionaries and the artists and the healers and the lovers and the scientists and the teachers and all those people who know that love really is the answer and that that's not the naive position but the most sophisticated position to get political, get real, and get vocal at a time like this.
Well, so I guess my question is, you know, your campaign is very philosophical. You have a certain, you know, a kind of ideology that you bring into this, a new vision for politics. There's there's a way that you can influence our political culture without being in the spotlight as the candidate yourself. I mean, look at the Koch brothers. There's all kinds of people out there who have a particular ideology they have infused into the mainstream of American politics that lots of people think is corrosive and should be, you know, we need to change that. So why did you think that it was the most effective way to change our politics was to put yourself at the center of this and be front and center and be the face of it rather than, you know, being like a Koch brothers of the politics of love?
First of all, their influence was wielded by billions of dollars. I don't have that kind of influence. I don't have that kind of power. I know how this country works. I'll spend the night at the White House. I'll spend my weekend at Camp David. What does it mean? It means they listen to you for an hour. We need to do more than say a few things. We need power. And that comes with political office. That comes with leverage. You know, at a certain point, you're talking to people. People are sitting in the seat of power. And you're talking to them, and you're advising them, and you're explaining things to them. And at a certain point, you just want to say, just get up and let me sit there. Because what's happening, and especially as a woman, go advise, please. No, it's too late. It's too late an hour. You know what actually having office, you know what that means? It means the levers of power. You know, when people say I'm here to elevate the conversation, I have a career already. The conversation is elevated. The American people are not the problem. You know, the American people are not the problem. Washington is the problem. So you're just standing on the sidelines. So I believe at this point, I was very serious what I said before. That was not metaphorical, and it's not just ideological. Hatred has become politicized in America today. The bigots and the racists and the homophobes and the anti-Semites and the Islamophobes and the xenophobes, these people are very serious. And they're convicted, and conviction is a force multiplier. And when hatred is being that loud, it's not enough for love to whisper. And so I think that the chronic political disengagement on the part of so many really wonderful, dignified, decent Americans is the problem. I don't want to model more of that. I know it's easier to stand on the sidelines. That's where you can have the nice career, the cushier life, people don't criticize you, people actually like you. You know, I understand all that. But this is too late an hour. You know, it's the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. You could be anti-slavery. You could say, oh, I'm living in Massachusetts, and I would never own a slave, and I think those people who own slaves are just crazy people. That position, while noble, would not of itself have moved the needle 1 inch for a slave. But there was a bridge you crossed it's a psychological bridge, and a moral bridge, and an emotional bridge, from anti-slavery to abolitionist. Abolitionist would mean not on my watch. I have moved from this is crazy to I'm an American woman, not on my watch.
All right. So if your model are the abolitionists, you wouldn't be running for president. Running for president is like getting down into the slime of the practicality of the in America. If you're an abolitionist, you'd be somebody sort of like either one of us on the outsides, not part of the establishment, calling attention to the. No, but so why if you view yourself as a modern day abolitionist, why are you doing something that no abolitionist ever did, which is to run for president?
They couldn't even vote. They certainly couldn't run for office. So, hello. Who knows what they might have done if they'd been able to. That's why there were suffragettes, in order to give women the right. And of course, Victoria Woodhull did run for office. And I say this with all due respect, would we be asking a man why he's doing this? I think it says something about where America is today. That any of us are being, because the implication is I'm an outsider.
Well, hold it. I would ask at least 10 men who are running for president right now why they're running, including many who are in that last debate stage with you. I'm blanking on their names at the moment. The gentleman, Delaney. I would ask him why he is running. Did I get his name wrong?
John Delaney?
Delaney. Your friend, I would ask him why he is running. I do not understand why he's running. So there's a lot of people running for president right now. I would ask why are they running.
This is my point, and I hear that. The implication, and stated, is you're an outsider. Why would you do this? My point is, in America, no one is supposed to be an outsider.
That's not what I was asking you.
Outside what? Outside what? It's just an elite within an elite. The DNC is just a private organization, you know, it's just a club. The Constitution doesn't even mention political parties. The founders in the Constitution said that the qualification to run for president is that you were born here, that you're 35 years old or older, and that you had lived here for 14 years. So if the founders had wanted to say, you had to have been a senator, you had to have been a congressman, you had to have been a governor, they would have. But they were leaving it to every generation to determine for itself the skill set that that generation feels is most necessary to navigate the times in which we live. We don't just need more political mechanics, we need political visionaries. And as much respect as I have for political mechanics, and the Democratic Party has great ones, I mean, all the people who are running, but at a certain point, you could have the best car mechanic in the world, but the car mechanic doesn't necessarily know what road you should take to San Antonio. And as far as this experience thing, very experienced politicians took us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. What we need more is moral certitude. And FDR said that the most important job of the presidency is moral leadership. He said the administrative aspect is secondary. So I have a lot of respect for the qualifications of all of the people who are running. I have a lot of respect for the political expertise. That is a qualification. I have different qualifications, and I submit that mine are at least as relevant.
So I actually wasn't asking a question about your qualifications, and I think in today's political climate where we have Donald Trump in office, this whole notion that somebody isn't qualified to be president is kind of moot. My point was that the experienced politicians who took us into Iraq, they were just exercising an ideology that was, you know, like neoconservatives were running the White House. They weren't the one. George W. Bush was just their president. So my point was only that if you feel like you are, you know, at the helm of a really transformative way of thinking and a philosophy that has the potential to transform our society, why do you think that the most effective way to wield that is to become president rather than exercise power the way that other people whose ideologies shape our nation exercise their power, which is to stay in the background and, you know, work the money, be in those rooms, do the advising, sort of what you were getting at with why isn't it effective to be in those rooms at the end of the day?
Because of where power lies. I've been in those rooms. I know how it works. I know how it works. Everybody should get how it works. It's all smiles, it's all handshakes. So glad you were here. Boy, you're really wise, that's really great. And then at the end of the day, it's all what the big pharmaceutical company lobbyists and the big health insurance company lobbyists say, the big gun manufacturing lobbyists say, what the big chemical company lobbyists say, and what the big oil and gas company lobbyists say, and what the defense contractor lobbyists say. Who are we kidding? The American people get this. We need now a president who's going to put those people where they belong, which is in their lane, not wielding undue influence, and bringing back the governmental authority and executive branch of the U.S. government to advocacy for the American people.
Well, so you'd mentioned earlier about this kind of disengagement that's going on in the electorate, but that, you know, people know what's going on and they're not stupid. And I'm wondering what you think about the sort of conversation that's going on that's overwhelming, really, the discussion around who the Democratic nominee will be. So much of the conversation focuses on, you know, who's going to flip those Trump voters. Yeah. Do you feel like is the Democratic Party right to focus on flipping Trump voters? Is that what's going to win this election?
I think the problem is that they're not focusing on what's going to flip Trump voters. And I'll tell you why. I hear one say that person says that he or she can prosecute a case against Donald Trump. Another one I heard say the other day, I'm going to prove that he's a fraud. I'm going to prove that he's a liar. Another person says I'm going to lead the fight against Donald Trump. And I'm asking myself, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? The people who love Donald Trump are going to vote for Donald Trump. So they're going to vote for Donald Trump, the ones who love him. The people who are already find his policies abhorrent are going to vote for the Democrat. So you don't have to say that. The people we have to reach are the people who didn't vote, the people who voted for third party and the people who voted for him, and I believe that there are millions of these, who voted for him but are disturbed. But if we go on and on about how bad he is and we're going to fight him and all of that, that's making them wrong. That's shaming them. That's scolding them. That will not make them want to vote for us. So my point is that they're clearly not. I mean, the level of emotional and psychological perspicacity is way low. And I also think that what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, with the exceptions of Bernie and Trump last time missed, was how angry people were. So now the Democratic Party, many of them are coming in saying, now we get it, and we're going to play to your anger. It's a different emotional moment. I don't think the emotional tone of this moment is anger. I think the emotional tone of this moment is exhaustion. And I don't think people are looking forward to another year and a half of just the fight. And so I believe that what this country needs and what the strategy should be, because it's what the goal should be, because it's the right thing to do, is inspiration. Inspiration. Let us end one aberrational chapter of American history and begin a new one. And even when you talk about my ideology, I don't think of myself as having an ideology. I simply believe that this all men are created equal thing is real, and we should mean it. And God gave all men inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That stuff's real. We should mean it. And I think what's happened in our country is that we have lost our psychological and emotional bonding with those principles. That's our mission statement. And right now those principles are just on marble walls or they're written on parchment. But if they're not alive in our hearts, they lose moral force. That's something much bigger than ideology. Those are the principles on which we purport to stand. And this country, we started as a country where on one hand, men risked their lives to sign the document establishing those principles. But out of the 56 who signed it, 41 were slave owners. So that characterological dichotomy has always been with us. We've always been both. We had been both a country founded on the most enlightened and aspirational principles that had ever formed the core of a nation, and we have at times, and this is as true today as at any other time in our history, been the most violent perpetrators of transgression against those principles. And every generation decides what chapter it's going to write in that ongoing story. We had slavery, then we had a generation that rose up with abolition. We had suppression of women. We've had generations that have risen up with two major waves of feminism and the women's suffrage movement. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, and then we had a generation that rose up with the civil rights movement. It's simply our turn. What we're dealing with now is just the latest iteration of that same aristocratic, ultimately tyrannous, economically backed nonsense. It's simply our turn. We're not having to deal with anything other generations haven't dealt with. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back.
All right, Marianne, you mentioned before in terms of some of the rhetoric you've been hearing directed at Trump from the campaign. And you said that the country has a feeling of exhaustion now. I would argue that at this very moment, we're gearing up for would probably be a very rough and tumultuous political fight over impeachment, and which is just a prelude to the election of 2020, and it will probably just outshout everything that comes out of the upcoming primaries. What's your position on the impeachment process? Do you think the Democrats are handling it the right way?
Yeah, I made a statement about a week and a half ago supporting the inquiry. Before that, I held back because of the obvious reasons. The realization certainly that the president has committed what I think could totally be argued are impeachable offenses. But the political reality is difficult because we all know, the House can impeach, but as long as Mitch McConnell and others like him are in charge in the Senate, they probably wouldn't remove him from office anyway. But once this Ukraine situation became so obvious, I think all of us have a constitutional responsibility. Every citizen does, and we simply must hold the line at a certain point when obviously lawless behavior is being demonstrated on the part of our president. But it's difficult, and this whole impeachment thing doesn't of itself necessarily make it any better for Democrats in 2020.
Why do you say that?
Well, because anything could happen. I mean, even if he's removed from office, for instance, anything could happen. You know, one of the things that always makes American politics fascinating is how unpredictable it is. But now, exponentially so. Anything could happen right now.
How do you think the Democrats should proceed in the face of Trump stonewalling them the way he is, in refusing to turn over documents, refusing to recognize their subpoena power?
Adam Schiff is, I mean, I think he's got his hand on the wheel there. I'm very satisfied, actually, with how they're going about this. They know what power they have. They have the subpoena power. It's fascinating to watch. It's very sobering to watch. But neither side is playing around.
How strong do you think the Republicans? Do you think they're going to bend on this? Do you think they're going to back off? There's suggestions that they're getting tired of just having to follow Donald Trump.
Well, I think those
Some suggestions, I say.
I think those Republican senators are looking at polls in their own states right now, because you actually have a majority of the American people now saying they support the impeachment inquiry. So I'm sure that those senators who have all been saying that they were just going to follow along because of they're not wanting a primary from a Trumpster are looking at the polls in their own states. Once again, every day something different happens. Every day you start to hear certain Republican senators saying certain things. Who knows?
Yeah, so you'd mentioned earlier about how the, the kind of main front-runner Democratic candidates are really focusing on demonizing Trump, and that's not going to flip anybody who's really for him, and it's not really speaking to people who are tired and demoralized and just sick of all of this rhetoric. So you mentioned on various occasions this idea that like Trump was sort of carried into office by these dark psychic forces, and my understanding of that is that it's like kind of anger and hatred and this feeling that you have something to protect, like that really mobilizes people to go out and do something that can mobilize, that can get people, out of their routine to go vote. Do you feel like, a politics of love or some kind of inspiration can similarly mobilize people in the next year, and what would that look like? What does I guess to really make it mechanistic, like what does the Democratic Party messaging have to be from the smartphone screens and TV screens and computer screens to actually get those people who feel like there's no point in even trying to do anything or to go to vote? What's going to get them out of their seats?
Well, first of all, I did not say, nor do I feel, that those dark psychic forces took him into office. I think rage and despair on the part of millions of people living with chronic economic anxiety took him into office. Some very good people voted for Trump. I know that because I know some. And that's why I believe Bernie Sanders would have won. There were two candidates last time speaking to and naming the economic rage felt by millions of people who knew, and they were right, that this country is rigged against them. Those were the two naming it. And so I felt there was going to be a cry of populist despair. It was going to be either an authoritarian populist or a progressive populist, and the progressive populist, we all know what happened with Bernie and with Hillary. Now that we are here, it's not that I believe that that's what drove him into office, but clearly the forces that you were talking about see him as an ally, and he is not above exploiting those things. But you and I had a conversation last night about children. And I think anyone in this room, certainly who has a child or loves a child, knows that you might be motivated if you hate somebody is nothing compared to what you would do to save a child that you love. So the idea that somehow love is not as motivating as hate, why don't we give the American people a chance to demonstrate how loving they are?
What does the ad look like? Like, you know, like what does the message look like?
What did you say?
This is the corruption of the political system. And I've been in those rooms. Well, tell me, Williamson, can you tell me what words to use? That's why I'm here. It's like, no. Because if those words don't align with your consciousness, then people hear you at the level that you speak from. People don't just hear your words. People can smell where you're coming from. People know what's deeply true. Who you are is as important as what you do. Who you are is important as what you say. And I don't, I have a lot of affection for the other candidates. This is not a criticism of the other candidates, actually, at all. It's simply that the mindset which dominates that system and is so entrenched, and they're just entrenched within it, the system itself is so corrupt. It's so exploitative. It's so usurious. What language can I come up with to make you vote for me? That's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here. This is how the political establishment works. Ooh, what group are you in? What do you want? Okay, I'll tell you what I think you want, and then maybe you'll vote for me. What does your group want? And then I'll tell you what I think your group wants, and then maybe you'll vote for me. I'm not here for that. I'm here to say, this is what I believe is true. And I believe that together as Americans, we must address these issues, whether this particularly pertains to you or not. Because ultimately, what pertains to the country pertains to all of us.
All right. You made reference a little while ago to Bernie Sanders. So let's try to get concrete and specific. Bernie is very specific about what he's articulating, what he wants. It's not just a general feeling coming from Bernie Sanders. He's not just that he's angry. Here I am defending Bernie Sanders. Bernie has something specific: health care for all as a universal right. College education as a right, as a universal right. An end to control of the system where the wealthiest pay off the politicians and own the discourse. Bernie's very specific about what he wants. So on those specific plans, are you with Bernie on his vision for health care for all and for college tuition for all?
First of all, my plans are just as specific as Bernie's, just as specific as Elizabeth's, just as specific as anyone else's, and I hope that anyone who is interested will go to Marianne2020.com and look at my issue section, and I definitely have. In terms of healthcare, I would say I'm somewhere right in between Pete and Bernie. I am with Bernie in that the ultimate goal, I believe, should be that health insurance is not a profit-making venture. But I'm sort of in the middle there because this is America, and not everybody, many people do not want to give up what they have. And also, I feel I want to be an agent of fundamental change, but I don't want to be an agent of chaos. And that's the problem we have now. The president, people want to change, and he just came up and blew everything up. And the kinds of changes that we need are so fundamental that I believe they must be made very carefully and navigated very tenderly. And that's why I am saying I'm sort of in between Bernie and Pete.
Wait, so I can't remember. Were you at the first debate? I'm getting all my debates mixed. So were you at the one where they made people raise their hand?
Yeah, but they were asking, would you give up the health insurance you have in Congress? And I'm not in Congress.
No, they were saying. Wasn't the question was would you take away people's private plans? Wasn't that the question they asked if they had to raise their hand?
I don't remember that being the question.
Yeah.
I would not. That's my point. That's why I'm saying I'm somewhere in between.
So you're among friends here, so you can really speak honestly and openly. Oh, okay. She didn't just fall off that turnip truck
Nice
the other
try,
day.
Ben.
You may be from Iowa. All right, now, that was a subtle dig at Iowa. Okay, so do you think it's absolutely realistic that you could have, you could keep the insurance companies involved in a healthcare transformation? I mean, Bernie's very concrete, and that's on this point that as long as you profit in the insurance business, you're never going to have health care for all. And it's just one of those, you talk about vague promises that you tell people that just keep stringing them along. Well, we're going to tell this group they can keep their private insurance, and we're going to tell these people they're going to get their universal care. And guess what happens, Marianne? Nobody gets anything. We got the same old, same old.
Well, this is certainly the legitimate conversation that everybody's having. The truth of the matter is no one knows if what you said is exactly true. but it's certainly a legitimate point. But with the idea, those who argue otherwise would say, if you make the Medicare option, if you make that public option and Medicare attractive enough, if you include dental, if you include eyes, if you include enough expanded opportunities and expanded rights and expanded healthcare options with Medicare, that ultimately that is where people go. Other people say, no, it'll gum up the system, much as you're saying, but the truth of the matter is we don't know. So this is all saying, my gut, you know, and if I'm your president, I will always, there has to be some bottom line, this is my gut, this is what my gut tells me. And I have not been able to cross over totally for that reason. I feel that too many Americans feel that they're happy with their health insurance, and if you just start ripping that out from people, I feel it's a problem.
So we've got about 5 minutes before we're going to have an audience Q&A. So I just want to ask you one more thing. And this goes back to something you talked about yesterday. So for those who don't know, yesterday Ben and I had an event at Sidetrack with ahead of the LGBTQ town hall, and Marianne was so kind to stop by as well and speak with us for a couple of minutes. And there was a question that had come in from someone Ben knows. A person had asked her to respond to this issue about a gay friend of his who had died of AIDS in the 80s, who was very much into Marianne's teachings and felt like he had failed because he was dying, and that he didn't love himself enough. And so it was hearkening back to this criticism of your teaching. And you had mentioned this thing yesterday that like that it was false, that it was an incorrect portrayal of what what you were writing at the time, and that basically it was these kind of smear. I believe that you used the term smears and lies that were being propagated about you, that were kind of keeping you off the debate stage and low in the polls. And so I guess my question is, what is there? If the smears and lies about you are keeping you down, like what is it about you that after such a successful 30-year career that people apparently still aren't getting? And what is your...
Well, that's not what happened here. No. People who know my work know I never said anything like that. People who know my work know that I never wrote anything like that. And no one who actually heard me ever speak would ever say that I said that.
So then why are you still
Why are
polling?
they doing that? You are both sophisticated political people. You know why they're doing that. They're doing that because I was the most Googled in 49 states after the second debate. They're doing it because I'm telling them.
No, I'm not. My question isn't about why are the liars doing what liars do. My question is, why is it that you are still not polling, that you're still polling at about 0.7%? What is it that's missing? Is it something in your campaign that's not quite there?
Nothing is missing in my campaign except a few $1 million that I wish I had that others have, and establishment support. Let's be very clear here. These polls are the equivalent of the superdelegates. Come on, everybody, let's wake up here. This is a very opaque process, and it's quote-unquote likely Democratic voters, which means people who have voted in Democratic primaries before. Many of the people who support me have not voted in Democratic primaries. Many of the people who support me are independents. Many of the people who support me even are not necessarily, some of them, many people say, I voted for Trump. And I'll tell you something else. We are going to have, in this next election, for the first time in history, there will be millions of Americans voting in this election who were not even born in the 20th century, who were not even old enough to vote last time. So this whole thing about the polls, this is all theater. I'm sorry. It's its own reality show. It's the DNC media, corporate media reality show. And I think
So you're not, it doesn't perturb you what the polls say, and...
Oh, listen, do I wish that I was in the third and fourth debate? Of course I do. And do I wish the polls were higher? Of course I do. But I know that where I go, my crowds are growing, that people are continuing to donate, that it's like, it's like when you write a book. You know when you've got something on your hands. You know when a conversation, you're here. You're here. I know that when I talk about a sociopathic economic system and the need for a seasoned moral repair, I feel heard. When I talk about millions of traumatized American children, here in Chicago, there was an article recently how 40% of all the girls in Chicago public schools have been diagnosed with PTSD that psychologists say is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan and Iraq. When I talk about how we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children, millions of traumatized children, a Department of Children and Youth, 13 million hungry children, I feel heard. When I talk about how a country no differently than an individual can't have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up the past, which is why we need to pay reparations for slavery and we need reparative measures towards Native Americans. I feel heard. When I talk about a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change, I feel heard. When I talk about the fact that our national security agenda is over-influenced by defense contractors so that their short-term profitability goes hundreds of billions of dollars above and beyond what the military says that they need to a dangerous degree, because you're not going to just back yourself off into peace by endlessly preparing for war. And the fact that the military-industrial complex should not dominate our national security agenda, I feel heard. What is that compared to the fact that a few elite establishment types don't want me to discuss those things, don't want me on the stage because they know that if I do, I just might be heard by a lot of people.
All right. So, when do you think? When do you think it will? The evidence that you're being heard be seen? Iowa, New Hampshire?
Listen, as long as people are coming to my events, and as long as people are sending the money that allow me to be in there, I'm attracting enough donations to do what I'm doing. I don't have enough donations to grow in the way I wish I could grow. But I have enough to be here. As long as I wake up in the morning and my heart says, go after it again today, then I'm going after it again. This option is in front of the American people. Whether the American people will choose that is in the hands of the American people. That's where it belongs. That's what democracy is. But I will know that I put that option in front of people. And then if the people of Iowa, the people of New Hampshire, the people of South Carolina, the people of Nevada, the people of California go, no, then that's cool, that's their choice, but I will know, well, I gave them the option to the best of my ability.
All right, very good. We're going to take some questions from the audience. I don't know how this works. Have we figured out how this works? We're taking questions from the audience. While we're figuring this out, I want to ask you a question, a local question. Looks like we're going to have a teacher strike in this town. And one of the issues, the main issues that is driving the union apart from the mayor and her Board of Education is funding on a regular basis, having nurses and librarians and social workers in the public schools of Chicago, all the public schools of Chicago, not just the well-to-do ones, the poor public schools. And I wonder what your thoughts are. The mayor and many of her supporters are saying we don't have that kind of money in the city of Chicago to afford every school to have a nurse, et cetera, and so forth. So if you're the president, what are you going to do to change something like that?
Let me tell you, if I'm president of the United States, every school in America should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. One of the most immoral things in the United States is that we base our educational system primarily on property taxes. That is wrong. And in a country that is the wealthiest nation in the world, to withhold education from a child because that child doesn't live in a wealthy neighborhood is a passive form of oppression. This is why I want a Department of Education. So that issue is huge. We have,
I would say it's more than passive.
Yeah, well, so we have a situation. Teachers come up to me everywhere I go, and they say, we didn't train for behavioral problems. It's not just that it's not even just that the classrooms are too large. It's some of the behavioral problems. It's the hunger. We have 13 million food insecure children. We have children in this country who go into their elementary school classes and ask if the teacher has something for them to eat. We have elementary school students on suicide watch. We have one mental health counselor for every 1,500 children. We have a massive, we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children. Now, I don't know about the money of Chicago, although I am pro-union, so whatever those teachers, I'd be with those teachers. But I'll tell you this, if I'm president of the United States, I can tell you the United States has plenty of money. This is not about how much money we have, it's about where we put our money. And part of what people will be voting for, if they vote for me, is a massive realignment of investment. We have millions of chronically traumatized children in this country, and we should be rescuing them no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster. And that's one of the reasons I'm running for president. The political establishment has simply normalized the despair of these children. And because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency, they're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. So there is a virulent strain of capitalism. Now, I don't feel this way inherent in capitalism. I'm not against capitalism. I'm for capitalism with a conscience. But a virulent strain of capitalism that has corrupted our government and hijacked our value system has no use for children. It has no use for older people, because it can't serve it. And so a government that has been hijacked by that economic system has no use for them either. That needs to stop, and that's why I'm running for president.
Okay, so I think I don't see any mics floating around, so I think we could just call on people. Yeah?
Can you turn the lights up a little?
Yeah.
It's so dark.
Somebody's in the booth. Oh, here we go. Okay, yeah, let's start over here, sir. If you can just stand up and speak up, that would be great.
Hi, Marianne. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, you too.
I just wanted to say that watching you in the debates, I was so excited. I didn't know much about you before the debates. And this is why I think you get a really critical point about the debates and polls and whatnot, because it's not allowing, I feel like it's not allowing you to get your message out there. But I didn't know a lot about you before the first presidential debate. And when I heard you talk about reparations and just the history of this country and institutionalized racism, it really struck a chord with me because you were speaking about it in real terms that people can understand, and not trying to criticize someone or penalize someone. You were just explaining the facts to where everyone can generally understand our problem in the United States. So I really appreciate that. My question for you is that I'm from a city not too far away from here called Gary, Indiana. And just recently you were named the most miserable city in the country by Business Insider. We're a Rust Belt city, U.S. Steel. We lost half of our population. We have, a high poverty, but we also have a lot of people that are fighting to make a difference and make a change. So what would you do specifically for Rust Belt cities like Gary, Indiana, Aberdeen, Youngstown, Detroit, to help those cities and to keep them from being belittled? What can we do to rise and bring those cities up?
We need a massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the lives of the average American. Like I said, you have 93 million people living in near poverty in the United States. This is why we need to repeal the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the very richest individuals and corporations. Although I put back in the middle class tax cut, because I think that should have been there already. We need to stop the corporate subsidies. We paid $26 billion to oil and gas alone last year. Martin Luther King said if they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. We need the United States government to take back its ability, its authority to negotiate for lower drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies. We need to look at our military spending, and we need to say to the military how much you need. Every dollar they need, they get. All the hundreds of billions of dollars on top of that just have to do with shoring up short-term profits for military contractors, that goes. For defense contractors, that goes. I agree with Elizabeth Warren. If you're a billionaire, and you made it righteously, God bless you, happy for you. We would like, however, 3% tax on those assets. And if you made 50 million, happy for you too, as long as you made it righteously, we would like 2% on that as well. Then we need to recognize that in the 1960s, we had a president, Lyndon Johnson, who actually had a war on poverty. And there was something called the Office of Economic Opportunity. And the Office of Economic Opportunity, the whole idea was for the government to be purposeful in helping people. Shock, like shocking concept, right? Starting in the 1980s with the advent and the promulgation, like you were talking about the Koch brothers, about trickle-down economics, all that the government should do is support market forces unfettered by not only government regulation, but also unfettered by any ethical or moral considerations. To be the organizing principle of our society, they closed down the Office of Economic Opportunity and turned all that money into block grants. Block grants is a euphemism for only giving it to them if we want to. Because the money would go to the states, but then the states, if there are forces in the states that want to withhold that money from poverty alleviation, then they can. So we need to reopen the Office of Economic Opportunity. We need to then take all that money. You do all the things that I just said, guess what? We're going to have cash on hand. And then what we're going to do is you start with those places. You immediately have your free health care. You immediately take from people just the sigh of relief. You don't have to worry what's going to happen if you get sick. You don't have to worry about what's going to happen if your child gets sick. And we're going to make college free tuition at colleges, state colleges and universities. Plus we should have the most amazing matrix of technical colleges. So you don't have to worry about what you're going to do. Your kids are going to have that. Plus, cancel those college loans. Not a plan to do this, cancel it. I'll tell you something. Those college loans are 1.5 trillion. That tax cut's 2 trillion. Trade ya. Okay. And then you spend your money in these neighborhoods. Now, I'll tell you something else. This is why I believe in reparations as opposed to just race-based policies. Because in a city like Gary, so you have race-based policies. Race-based policies are good, and they provide economic restitution. But reparations are better, for several reasons. First of all, they carry an inherent mea culpa, that there is a spiritual and a moral and a psychological and emotional power that comes from the fact that it's an admission on the part of a people of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is acknowledged, and the willingness on the part of people to pay it. Now, take Gary, Indiana, and many places like that. A race-based policy would say, oh, we're going to come in there and we're going to have anti-discrimination and anti-unemployment, and if somebody's lived in an apartment for 30 years and they can't be kicked out, what can happen with reparations is let's say you have a real estate committee made up of descendants of slaves who are themselves huge real estate moguls, and they do exist in this country. Then with that kind of money, $500 billion dispersed over 20 years, they look at Gary, Indiana, and they say, we need to buy that neighborhood. It's not just justice, it's power. These are the kinds of things we need to remember. All this suffering, all this huge unnecessary suffering, it didn't come out of nowhere, ladies and gentlemen. It came because of a massive transfer of wealth. It's called theft, where I come from. That has occurred over the last 40 years. Bad public policy created all this, and good public policy will uncreate it and get this country back on track.
Let's take another question.
Yeah.
Over here.
So this is sort of, I wouldn't say my dilemma. So I come from a very progressive circle of friends. I made sure a lot of them heard you because they have to listen to you more than 2 minutes, and they respect me enough. They go listen, and they're always surprised. I've changed their point of view. But in my heart of hearts, I'm so excited about the progressive wing, and I'm secretly hoping that the progressive wing does bond between Bernie, Elizabeth, and yourself, because I might have this understanding wrong, but I believe in some of the southern states it's winner take all, and I don't want a Biden presidency. So I guess my question to you is, keep doing your voice. I'm 100% behind you, but can the progressive wing be progressive enough to strategize and make sure that part of the Democratic Party is the winner in the end?
So what you're saying is, if you're not polling at a certain number, and if you don't feel that you could actually place, then right before Iowa drop out so that it's very irrelevant?
No, I'm not saying that. I feel like Iowa, all the swing states, we need you guys all to go for it. I'm a little worried about the southern states, which are probably gonna go Republican anyway, but my understanding from people I know in
Well, wait a minute,
politics-
we're talking now though about the primaries.
primaries.
We're talking
Well,
now
I'm talking
about the
about the primaries,
nomination.
but someone told me in the primaries even, it's a winner take all. That's
No,
not-
No,
South
not-
Carolina works
not in
just.
the
that's good to
primary,
know.
yeah,
Okay, you're
not in the
educating
primary.
me, because a
Yeah.
friend of mine who said,
And
yeah.
Yeah, you don't listen to your friends.
Yeah.
That's advice number one, all right?
I was worried, but, okay. So
That's
just
the
go
last
ahead,
person you
Megan.
should
Oh, you
listen
just
to.
relieved me. Forget my question.
Miracles are happening.
Miracles are happening. You want any other
I
information?
hope the progressive wing sticks together a little bit, which I am seeing that you guys are attacking
You
each
know,
other.
I
Yeah.
feel very confident. We know what the bigger challenge is here. Once the nominee is chosen, I don't see any of these people going rogue or anything. I think, I'm not worried about any of that at all.
Well, you're going to support whoever the Democratic nominee is, correct?
Absolutely.
If Joe Biden, you would support Joe Biden?
Question over here.
To your, thanks. To your point at the beginning about you have to understand the cause, I'm wondering if you can help us understand the cause of poverty, and specifically unemployment's at an all-time low, wage growth's at a 9-year high, and I was Googling poverty levels over time, and it's at a low, and it seems to follow economic cycles. When you're towards the end of a boom cycle, poverty goes down, and then if you're in a recession, poverty goes up. So we're kind of at an all-time low in poverty, it seems, from Dr. Google. So what's the cause now, and what happens?
No. Unemployment being down does not mean poverty is down.
Poverty is down.
No, poverty, we have 93 million people living in near poverty in the
Lowest
United
percent in the
States.
last 10 years.
And many of the people, in these unemployment numbers, be real aware how many of those unemployment numbers include people who have to work 2 and 3 jobs to put food on their table. And also be aware of how many people have just dropped out completely, they've stopped even trying, and so are not mentioned in there. When you have 93 million Americans in the richest nation in the world living in near poverty, when you have 38 million Americans living in poverty, when you have 13 million children food insecure, don't go telling me the economy's good. It's good for whom? So when the corporate media goes on and on about how good it is, it's good for the people that they're talking for. This is what I mean, sir. I don't think that the average person in America who creates wealth wants to feel like their ability to create wealth is at the expense of somebody else having a chance to. The problem is not that people can get rich in America. That's a good thing. The problem is that today, not enough people can get rich. If you have millions of American children who go to school every single day, in classrooms where they don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read, that means that if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished. The chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have classrooms in America where they don't even have glue sticks and paper. So what chance do these kids have? You know, what are the realistic chances that they can have a shot at it? So this is just about realizing that in America, in order to form a more perfect union, the ideal here is that everybody, if they work hard enough, should have a shot at it. We have neighborhoods in this country, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, we're in Chicago. Let's all stop pretending we don't know what we know. This is not about Americans not knowing what's up. This is about our owning what we know. And one of the reasons we don't own what we know is because we have a political establishment which does as much to distract us from the deeper truths we need to look at as to help us look at them so that we can move beyond them. We have millions of American children, and they're here, yes, as elsewhere, living in what's called America's domestic war zones. That's why these kids have such PTSD. These 40% of girls in Chicago public schools who are deemed to have PTSD. So when you say, what's the cause of poverty? Human despair, human hopelessness, lack of food, lack of education, lack of opportunity, too much corporate money influencing the U.S. governmental policy.
Yes.
I love everything that you're saying because I feel the truth is coming out and no other candidate speaks like you do. I'm wondering if you became the president, and I hope you are, how do you think you would get these wonderful ideas through the Senate? All those people are the ones you're talking about that sit on the Senate. I feel that they would block you just like they did with Obama so many times when he was trying to do things. How could you switch that? Or how could any candidate, if they get in, what are we going to do
Well, first of all,
about all of this?
if the consciousness of this country is such that it would make me president, it's a good bet it would be the consciousness of this country would be shifted enough that we might not have a Republican Senate. So that. Listen, any Democratic president, given to the world today, given how the Mitch McConnells of the world act, it is reasonable to assume that if you have a Democratic president and you have a Republican Senate, that the Republican Senate is not necessarily going to behave as the honorable, as the loyal opposition, but much like today, just standing to oppose. Like when they said their goal of the Senate was to make Obama a one-term president. So I would have the same kind of problems that that others have. However, let's remember the president has a lot of power. The president, I would still have the power to make a world-class environmental scientist the head of the EPA. I would still have the power to establish a Department of Children and Youth. I would still have the power to give greater support to the peace builders. I would still have the power to have a humanitarian rather than the ex-CEO of Exxon or some corporatist par excellence like Mike Pompeo be head of the State Department. You know, there's still a lot of power that the president has. But most importantly, and I believe that this is the greatest power that I would wield, I have a way of talking with the American people. I'm letting the cat out of the bag. So this country's going to be okay. I'm letting the cat out of the bag. And if I'm president, I'm really letting the cat out of the bag. And so this country's going to be okay, even if they shoot me 5 days in. I didn't mean
All right,
to
where was you going with that?
I think we have time for one more.
You know what I'm saying? I didn't mean that to sound like it did. I didn't mean, but what I'm saying is, it doesn't matter once the American people wake up.
No,
Once the American people wake up. That is what it's
All right, this gentleman in the front row has a question right here.
Thank you. Hi, Marianne, please forgive me. I'm fangirling over here. So Americans like myself are rationing life-saving medications because we are being price gouged by the pharmaceutical industry. It is not only the greed and recklessness of Big Pharma, it is also the for-profit bureaucratic system that is designed to make as much money as possible on the backs of the sick, the elderly, and the terminally ill. I live with chronic economic anxiety every day due to both big pharmaceutical industries and health insurance companies that have a stranglehold over my life. They have the power to deny and prevent me from getting the much-needed life-altering and life-saving medications I desperately need. As long as the insurance companies continue their practices, a public option, in my opinion, is not enough. You say that you don't want to be an agent of chaos, yet health insurance companies are an agent of chaos for so many people. We need you to take the moral leadership and support a universal healthcare system, and lives cannot wait through a public option debate. So I guess my question is, how can we move you to support a single-payer healthcare system as quickly as possible so that we can try and prevent 45,000 Americans dying every year due to this ineffective, destructive system?
Great question.
Well, millions of Americans live in the same situation that you do. And if in fact we cannot make the transition, the question is whether or not that's totally true. Some people, yourself included, and I think you also, argue that it simply can't be done otherwise. I am not convinced that it cannot be done otherwise. But whether as a candidate or as a president, if I become convinced that it cannot be done otherwise, then I'm full on with that system of Medicare for all, single payer. because what matters is that you have this despair, that this despair be alleviated. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that, that the United States government sacrificed, surrendered its own ability to negotiate with Big Pharma for lower prices. I understand this. I continue to believe that it's possible for government policy to compensate in the meantime. You seem unconvinced that that is, in fact, you seem convinced that it absolutely can't. And you seem convinced that it absolutely can't. The moment I'm convinced that it absolutely can't, I am full on with you. And I will be with Cenk on Young Turks next week. He'll be saying that I get texts from friends all the time. What is wrong with you? This is the one area you don't get it. I don't understand.
I'll give you one day.
Yeah.
That should be enough to convince you, yeah. One day. Your second day in White House. You know that
what?
guy in the front row, he in Chicago, he was right, man. Single payer.
I think it's more complicated than most people allow.
Well, I know it's complicated. I mean, Bernie's right. You're up against a fight. I mean, that's just not going to, because they're not going to say, oh, you have such a convincing argument about people in Chicago. They've been tolerating sickness and illness. It's just like here with the school board. They don't have enough money for nurses in the school. We've been without nurses in the schools of Chicago for 10, 20, 30 years. So it's like you have to really push somebody to do something. You just can't say, well, you know, I'm going to preach it and I'm going to convince people in their heart or minds.
But I don't understand where you get that that's what I'm saying. Well, I don't think that that's what I'm saying. If you have it,
it's kind of what I was thinking you were saying about.
That's what a public option means. If a public option, if Medicare is the public option, why I'm unconvinced that he would not be taken care of.
Let me tell you something, how it works in Chicago, and maybe it probably works this way. And they give you a vague promise that they're going to who the mayor is, city councils. They give you a vague promise, and then the first year maybe when everybody's paying attention, they kick in a little bit. Then the second year, budget cut, they take it back. It's not written down anywhere. Third year, we're going to change the plan. Then they change it again, and next thing you know, the vague promise is nothing. So when you take that on a national level with something as all important as health care, if you come in with a vague promise that we're going to have, it's just like Obamacare. They came in, we're going to have Obamacare. First year, it's getting cut. Second year, it's getting cut. Third year, and now there's a lawsuit right now in Texas that if the Republicans are victorious at that lawsuit, they will knock out Obamacare completely. Then what is anybody going to do?
But Obama could have stood for a public option. He himself argued it would not stand for it. He could have stood for a public option at the time.
Well, he backed off for the same reason that Clinton's backed off ultimately in the 90s. They don't want to have a fight. You get a little resistance from powerful people, and you back off. And as soon as you back off, as soon as you compromise, as soon as you water down whatever the principle is that you're supposedly standing up for, then millions and millions of people lose. And that's when you ask me, I'm not running for office, so I don't want to take your time, but you ask me why so many people are disillusioned with the political system, it's that they see every single politician back off whenever they get a little confrontation, whenever things get a little tough. I've seen it happen for years in the city of Chicago, and then they just back off, and then the people say that you can't win. The system will just sell you out from the get-go.
I certainly agree with that, which is why I'm running. I just don't see where in this particular case, on that particular issue, that is necessarily more true with the public option. But I'm open.
But look, your daughter lives in England.
Yes.
She's got NHS. If she gets sick, she goes to the doctor. It doesn't cost her an arm and a leg. She's not going to be in tens of thousands of dollars of debt because she got sick. Why can't we have this in this country?
Well, the problem is how this whole thing was set up to begin with. That's the problem. If we had started differently, it would be a different kind of situation. You know, I think a lot of people... some people would argue, for instance, take a country like Canada, because basically you're saying, okay, what about a country like Canada? Well, what many experts say about Canada is if you're very, very sick, you're going to get excellent care in Canada. But if you aren't sick yet, but you just kind of have a feeling, and you kind of just like to have that test because you just have a feeling, you won't necessarily get it at all. So there are people who argue that these supplemental health insurance policies, they want them. But for everything that you say, there are people who would, I listen to this constantly, every day. I listen to it, and I understand the passion on both sides. And what it always comes back to for me is we actually don't know. But I can tell you this, if I were your president, and I heard about one situation, even one, where someone like yourself, he's not getting care, and he can't get care under this situation the way we have it, then what I can tell you is that to the best of my ability that would change, and it would change immediately. In the meantime, I do understand, given the fact that I am a serious progressive on so many issues, given the chance that for me the political risk is that I'm not going full on with you. For me the political risk is that my gut can't get there yet. My gut simply can't go there. I'm sorry, if as a candidate I feel I owe it to you to tell you what's your deepest gut truth. And as president, I would always go with what my deepest gut truth. And so I'm sorry, I have so many friends saying to me, I get texts every day, I get emails, what is wrong with you? I get it. My gut, I'm just not there yet. Some people say, you're getting closer, I know you're getting closer, I know you're getting closer right now. But one thing that I don't feel I have any less commitment, not just concern. I don't have any less conviction or commitment to you and your situation than you do or than you do. I promise you that.
Well, our guts are telling us it's time to wrap this up.
Well done, Maya.
It's 8:30. Let's all give Marianne a round of applause.
I need the 25,000 more in trying to get into the fifth debate. I need the 25,000 more unique donors. So if you haven't given me a buck, even a buck would do for that. I hope that you will tag me on social media, talk to your friends, because with a grassroots campaign, that's what we need. So if you do feel, you've got a long time before you're voting for anyone, but if you know for sure that this campaign should exist, you feel that, I hope that you will help me. If you do not feel that I'm your candidate, I respect that entirely. If you do feel that I am, please help me. Please sign up to volunteer, and let's kick some ass and make this happen. Thank you. Sunday morning, I will be speaking at Christ Universal Temple at 10:30. At what address?
1180. It's on the website. Sorry.
It's on there.
We have flyers at the door.
And that's going to be at a big church. That's going to be Johnny Coleman Church. That'll be a good Sunday. That'll be you want to come. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Fantastic.